Welcome, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for coming to our Conversations with the Fed event. My name is Carmi Matson. I'm the manager of public programs here at the Minneapolis Fed. We appreciate you coming out tonight. I know it's a gorgeous evening, so we're glad to see that you're all here with us. We have some collateral there at your chairs, ways that you can get involved with us. We've got a brochure about touring the Fed, as well as the Fed Explained, talks a little bit about what we do. Some of you may have seen us recently at the State Fair. We're very out and about. There is also a handout called Stay Connected that details some of the ways that you can get involved with us. Rob's picture is on that. You're already here. But our next Conversations with the Fed event is with Abigail Wozniak, the director of our Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. So that's coming up in November. Also, the flip side of that flyer mentions that we've got a speakers bureau. If you're interested in having someone from the Fed come to your organization, you can go to our website and fill out a little form. We also have an annual high school essay contest. So if there are high schoolers in your life, this year we are asking them to write an essay about trade, a very hot topic right now. So we are happy to engage with you on any of those items. There are also other ways to engage with us at the Fed, one of which is to serve on our local board of directors here at the Minneapolis Fed, and we are honored to have a board member present with us tonight. I think, Kate, you're there in the back, Kate Kelly from PNC Bank. So thank you, Kate, for being with us. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speaker for this evening, Rob Grunewald, and I'll let him introduce himself, although for many of you, I think he needs no introduction.
Great. Well, thanks, Carmi, and welcome everyone for Conversations at the Fed. I'm going to make sure that this other mic is turned off. So a little bit about myself before we begin. I've been at the Fed for 25 years. This is my only place of employment and have enjoyed my time here a lot. I am an economist. I have a degree in applied economics, a master's degree from the University of Minnesota, and started out looking more at regional economics and then got involved in this particular issue with Art Rolnick, who is here as well in the back, of our former director of research. That was back in 2003 when we released our first paper. 4 years ago, I joined the community development department and is serving as an economist there. So tonight we're going to talk about early care and education. And I know that many of us have different backgrounds coming to tonight. Some of you work in the field, I recognize you. And some of you are coming to this topic fresh. So we're going to be looking at some of the fundamental research in this particular area. But as we move on, we'll be talking about some policy issues too and sharing some data. So as we start, I'm just going to start with the end, which is what we want to walk away with. And that first is that the early years are a sensitive period for brain development. And I'm going to share a little bit of that research with you so that you can talk at your next event with folks about the importance of the early years. The early education and health investments also yield a high public return, and especially when we reach children who are from disadvantaged environments. We're going to start the talk by looking broadly at investments in young children in early childhood development, but then we're going to narrow in on this topic of early care and education and what childcare means not only to children, but as workforce infrastructure that allows parents to enter the workforce and be productive at their jobs. And finally, to look at public policy, the importance of providing resources to low to moderate income families to access a variety of high quality early care and education programs. To begin with, I'll talk a bit about the Federal Reserve. Then we'll move into looking at some of the research that Art Rolnick and I have looked at over the years. We'll then hone in onto the aspects of the early care and education market that are important, the participants and what that market looks like. And then we'll end with looking at some of the investments that Minnesota has made in this area and where some more could be made going forward. So those of you who are on the tour need no introduction to this map. This is the map of the Federal Reserve System, the 12 reserve banks, and the Board of Governors that make up that system. We're responsible for managing the flow of money and credit in the economy in such a way as to achieve stable prices and also achieve maximum employment. We're one of the institutions that regulates banks. We oversee the entire system of payments, and we are also the bank for Uncle Sam. That is, we provide services for the U.S. Treasury. As I mentioned, I'm in the Community Development Department. And this department started after the Community Reinvestment Act that was passed in the late 1970s. And as part of this, the Federal Reserve got involved to create this department to make linkages between financial institutions and lending opportunities in low to moderate income communities. Our departments look at a variety of community development issues around our 12 reserve banks and the Board of Governors, anything from workforce development to issues around housing. Some banks even specialize in transit or rural development. And so this research now is on early childhood development is housed within community development. But as I mentioned, this started back more in our research area with art. And with this paper, Early Childhood Development, Economic Development with a High Public Return. Back in 2003, we made a case that if you're going to focus on economic development, where are you going to achieve that high rate of return? And we argued that it's important to invest in human capital, and that on the margin you would achieve the highest rate of return if you spent that dollar in a young child before that child reached kindergarten. We walked through two pieces of research that help make that case. The first goes to brain development, our first takeaway. In the early years are a very sensitive period for brain development. This is a slide from the Center on the Developing Child, bring it back here, that depicts the parts of the brain that are accelerating and growing fast in a child's brain during the first few months and years of life. During the first year of life, the parts of the brain that regulate sensory pathways are peaking in their development, also language. And during the first couple of years, the parts that regulate higher cognitive functioning are peaking in their development. You can also look at this story in terms of pictures such as this. When the child is born, there are some connections that are formed in womb, but the experiences that that child has during those first few months and years dictate how those connections are made in a child's brain. And during the first couple years of life, in a given second, there could be 1 million connections formed. So during the first few years, we have all of the connections forming, and then the brain starts to set itself to become efficient relative to the environment that that child is growing up. So if the child is hearing lots of vocabulary words, is having experiences with other children, socializing, learning about his or her environment, that these are children who are likely to arrive at kindergarten prepared to succeed in school. But research also shows that if a child is subject to excessive adversity, that this disrupts that healthy development. And children who are subject to what scientists have called toxic stress, that is high levels of adversity that come from, let's say, growing up in poverty, any exposure to abuse or neglect while growing up, or household dysfunction. These are children who arrive at kindergarten who are at risk for being behind their peers. And where children are relative to their peers at kindergarten is where they tend to stay. So these early years make a large difference in a child's life. A well-known study by Hart and Risley that was conducted a few decades ago already went into the homes of families with different backgrounds, the parents, and they recorded all the vocabulary words and the types of interactions that happened between children and their parents, parents that had professional backgrounds with college education, and also children that were growing up with very low income. And by 18 months, they started to see differences in the number of vocabulary words that these two groups of children were acquiring. And by the age of 3, the children who had college-educated parents had twice the vocabulary as children who are growing up with very low income. So all of this research from neuroscience, brain development show that the early years matter, and they have lifelong consequences. The next piece of research that we want to turn to are some studies that look at the economic return from providing investments in young children who come from disadvantaged environments, and to look over a long time horizon at what those benefits look like. And one of the widely cited studies in the literature is the Perry Preschool Project. How many of you have heard of the Perry Preschool Project? Just to get a sense in the room. Thank you. So those of you who are familiar with Perry are familiar with a slide that looks like this. This is a cost-benefit analysis of the Perry project. The children who received the Perry preschool program attended for 2 years at ages 3 and 4. They had well-trained teachers. The teachers were paid at the same level as teachers in the rest of the school system there. And the teachers also visited the homes of those young children to reinforce lessons learned in the classroom in that home environment. And the researchers were able to keep track of the participants now up to the middle 50s. So the children were randomly assigned to either be in the Perry project or to be in the control group. And so here are the implications for some of the results. So first of all, we have the cost of the program. In today's dollars, the Perry project costs about $12,000 per child per year. We then see savings to the K through 12 system because they saw reductions in special education. There are higher participant earnings. That is, at the follow-up surveys, they were able to check to see what employment and wages the Perry graduates were earning relative to the control group. Now, most of that is a private benefit, but some comes back to the public in the form of higher tax revenue. And then we see reductions in crime. So all crime rates in the Perry project were essentially cut in half, from felonies to misdemeanors. And we see savings to the criminal justice system due to reductions in incarceration costs and court costs and reduced need for police protection, and also reductions in costs to the victims of crime. So when we add up all of the benefits relative to the costs, it's a very high ratio of benefits to cost, $16 returned for every dollar invested. And what we did here at the Minneapolis Fed is we calculated that annual rate of return. What is the internal rate of return over the lifetime of these benefits? And we calculate the public return at 16%, the total return at 18%. The public return refers to the benefits that accrues to the non-participants in the program. James Heckman, who is a Nobel laureate economist at the University of Chicago, has reanalyzed the entire data, has made a more conservative assumption about how to calculate the cost of crime, but still shows a very high rate of return at 10%. Even when we compare this to returns in the stock market over a long time horizon, let's say 30 years, adjusted for inflation, the stock market returns about 6%. Good. I'm going to take questions at the very end. If you could hold it.
This slide, I don't know. You mentioned 18, 16. Is that 2% of the individual rate of return then?
It's the annual average rate of return. So if you take, so the question is, a little more clarification about what the 18 and the 16% is. Oh, the difference between the two. Yeah, we can talk about that afterwards. Actually, you can't just subtract the total and to get the individual. The individual is higher than that. If you want to do some good math afterwards, come up here. We'll sit down and look at all of the data. But to say that this is a very high rate of return. Some benefits that have been recently found at this interview of participants at the age of 50 have not been included in these benefits, and they actually are showing intergenerational effects. And that is, participants in the study were interviewed in their 50s, and they were asked about their children and some outcomes that they had. And they found that among the children of the Perry participants, for example, 67% graduated and completed high school without a suspension, compared with 40% of the children in the control group. 60% were never suspended, addicted, or arrested, compared with 40% in the control group. And 59% were employed full-time or self-employed, compared with 42% in the control group. So it's showing evidence that you can actually impact the next generation of children with this early intervention. The Perry Project is joined by 3 other long-term studies that use this economic analysis to show what the economic return is. The Abecedarian Educational Childcare Project was conducted in North Carolina in Chapel Hill. This was a full-day program starting at just a few months of age up into kindergarten. And they found that children performed better in school. They were less likely to need special education. 3 times more likely to go on to college. And in their 30s, they were able to conduct biometric measures of the children who attended the Abecedarian versus the control group, and they found that there were better health impact. In fact, they were less likely to have the precursors of heart disease and diabetes. The Chicago Child Parent Project is a 2-year program that provides preschool and also parent education. They found benefits that look similar to the Perry Project. And the Elmira Prenatal Early Infancy Project is the start of what is known as the Nurse Family Partnership Home Visiting Program, where a registered nurse counsels an at-risk expectant mother starting in pregnancy through birth and until the age of 2. And there they found that the family was more financially stable, that the children performed better, and they had better school readiness, and also had reductions in juvenile crime. So all of these ratios are over 1. So what does that mean? Getting a positive return on investment. And when we look at internal rates of return, they range from 7% up to nearing 20%. We can also ask who benefits the most from these projects. Well, certainly the children and their families benefit. But across these 4 projects, the majority of benefits, 60 to 65% of the benefits, accrue to the non-participants, to the public, to the taxpayer. So this means you don't even have to like children to achieve this high rate of return. You could be Scrooge before his enlightenment in the Christmas Carol. It just makes good business sense. So looking across all of the research in these projects, but others as well, there's some principles that we can look at to achieve a high rate of return in early childhood development. The importance of investing in quality so that we have well-trained teachers and home visitors and professionals. That these programs are engaging parents, even the early care and education programs that we'll talk about where a child might be in a child care center for 40 hours a week, but those successful programs are engaging parents. Starting early, so of our full continuum of investments are starting prenatal, and bringing to scale. As we look at waiting lists for a number of our programs and funding streams that fall short of providing these services, especially for lower income families, we want to find ways to bring this research to scale. And then finally, the importance of matching services to risk profile. All families are different, all children are different. But as we find children who are especially are high risk to be able to bring services to those families, maybe they will be expensive at the start, but this research is showing that in the long run they'll pay off. So this is a quick background of the research around early childhood development in terms of some of the brain development science, some of the economic case for investing in young children. Now we're going to hone in on one part of early childhood development, that's early care and education. And as we do so, I want to highlight just some of the participants in this market. We could also call this stakeholders, perhaps. But who do we want to, what sectors, what part do we want to look at in order to understand the early care and education market? We have providers. In fact, I believe we have 1 or more providers in the room with us tonight. Parents that will be demanding childcare and education. Businesses have a stake in this because to the extent that parent employees are able to enter the labor force, and when they take a job at a company, that they are productive at that job. And then government and taxpayers. As we've shown, there can be a high rate of return for investing in this area. Now, a lot more attention has come to early care and education because of the tight labor markets that Minnesota and many parts of the country have been facing. And that is, we hear from businesses that it's harder for them to fill open positions. And one aspect of filling those open positions is recognizing that when parents with young children are working for them, that childcare can be an impact on whether they keep a job or whether they're productive at that job. So we've been hearing more from business leaders about this importance of this sector as workforce infrastructure. So first of all, let's turn to providers. How many of you have purchased childcare or have sent a child to preschool? Yeah, so you have your own stories to share. So there are many different parts to the whole early care and education sector. There are home-based or family child care programs. And these are regulated programs that are licensed in a home environment. Depends upon the ages of the children as to how many children are in that home, but they could range somewhere in Minnesota between 5 and 14, depending on that mix of age and number of adults there. Center-based childcare provides larger amounts of services to children at those centers. And in Minnesota, the average size is somewhere between 60 and 70, but you can get programs that are well over 100, 200 that have multiple classrooms. They're also, all these programs are licensed and regulated. Private preschool is a smaller sector within this market that is providing somewhere around half-day preschool to young children, usually of preschool age, that is ages 3 and 4. Public preschool can be provided within school districts, and this is using state or local funding to provide what's often a half-day experience, mostly focused on 4-year-old children, sometimes 3-year-old children. And Head Start and Early Head Start are federal and state-funded programs. Minnesota is one of the states in the country that adds to the money that comes from the federal government for Head Start. Early Head Start provides services for children ages 0 to 2, and Head Start provides services for children ages 3 to 4. In Early Head Start, it could be a home visiting program or a center-based program or a mixture. Head Start traditionally is at a center, usually half-day, but more programs are providing a full-day experience. So in terms of all of these offerings, those that provide family childcare and the center-based childcare tend to focus more on the childcare aspect because they tend to offer services for every day of the week for multiple hours. So you can get up to that 40, 45 hours or so of care for a working parent. There is also non-licensed providers, and this is more informal arrangements with a family member, a neighbor, and a relative. These arrangements are often used in combination with these licensed arrangements, and they tend to be more variable in terms of their quality and also their reliability. In Minnesota, if we take all of the capacity within the licensed childcare area, if we have 10 children, there would be 4 licensed childcare spaces for every 10 young children under the age of 5. It's a challenging sector, and as all surveys and research about childcare shows, that margins are lean. It relies on labor. You need human beings to provide this service. You're not going to be able to farm this out to technology. We need people to care for our young children. And the ratios for infants and toddlers, of course, are fewer children relative to that caregiver, and then more children to caregivers as we get up to preschool age children. In Minnesota, the average hourly wage for a child care worker is $11.61. So it's a low compensation, and those that run programs are challenged with keeping employees on their staff and not turning over. As you can imagine, one of the aspects of quality is to have continuity of care. This is what prices look like within the markets, both within the Twin Cities and also in greater Minnesota for childcare, which represents 58% of capacity within the childcare market in Minnesota, and within family childcare, which represents 42%. So for a center within the Twin Cities, that could be around $15,000 on an annual basis. Basically what you see here is taking the weekly rate and multiplying it times 50. So we have a 50-week year. For family-based programs, they are less expensive, but still it can be a substantial amount of family income in order to send a child to childcare. Now we'll turn to the parents. So parents are facing choices of trading off parental care for childcare. And I say this for some families, especially single-parent families, there's really not so much of a choice. You need to find some way to get out there and work. For two-parent families, they may be more in that way of negotiating. Do we have two parents in the workforce, or do we have one stay home and provide childcare? And what are parents wrestling with, or what are those factors? One is first just the preferences for work relative to childcare. Next is just what's happening in labor markets. If wages and benefits and job conditions are good, that might lean parents towards choosing to work and sending their child to childcare. Also, parents are going to have a threshold for what they will consider as quality. That is, they want to have teachers who are well trained, that the program's following a curriculum, that they're providing an enriched experience for their children in those settings. Parents that have a high threshold are going to be more selective in their childcare choices. And then, of course, the cost of childcare, which you just saw, which is the price component. And we also need to add in transportation to that cost. So this is what parents are wrestling with. And those of you that raised your hand, you all wrestled with that or might be wrestling with it in the moment. So here's some additional context for parents in Minnesota. Parents in Minnesota and the country with young children tend to have lower levels of family income relative to families that have older children or no children. That is, that they're early in their earning years, so they tend to start with lower wages and salaries. And also they might have a parent staying at home caring for a child. So they start already with lower income. Within the United States and Minnesota, however, there's a wide range and disparity of income. If we take all of the family income for children under age 6 in Minnesota and look at the median and then also these percentiles that you see on this chart, at the 25th percentile, that is the bottom quarter of families with young children, that cutoff is $35,000 per year. So 1/4 of Minnesota families with young children are making $35,000 or less. We go to 75th percentile, moving above that, that is the top quarter of income, are making over $115,000. So there's a wide range of income, and also brings to, as we talk about public policy, about where to target resources, especially for those families that need it the most. In terms of children who are in single-parent families and two-parent families, you can see here that it's about 3/4 are in two-parent families. And for each of these, two parents, and where the mother is the primary caregiver in the home, and where a child is living with the father as a single father, in Minnesota we have very high labor force participation rates. So these are some of the highest in the country in all three of these. So for the two-parent families, they tend to be making that choice to both parents to be entering the labor force. And as you see, 80% for single mothers, 90% for single dads. So with this many children, with all of their parents in the labor force, they are being cared for somewhere. And we want to understand the quality of those arrangements, the enrichment of those arrangements for their education, but also the reliability for parents themselves, so that when they go to their jobs, they're not concerned about whether they have to leave their job and go pick up their child because that arrangement fell apart. Now let's turn to businesses. As I mentioned before, businesses are getting much more interested and expressing their concern about the availability of childcare because they're feeling the impact of that. What affects them is the availability of workers. And so right now in tight labor markets, they're maybe more in a position to look at how to provide benefits to parent employees so that their childcare is more supported. They also are going to be looking at the cost to recruit and also retain their employees, also what the costs of turnover are. And then employee productivity. If they're seeing that childcare problems are an impact to productivity, that might get them more involved in helping to support their parent employees with their childcare. Or they also might get more involved in their local community about supporting access to supply of childcare in their local area, or even get involved at a policy level, at the state level. In Minnesota, business leaders have played an important role of helping to move some of our policies in this state forward around early care and education. So recently, surveys have been conducted of parents to find out what impact childcare problems are having on their workforce decisions and also the time that they spent at work and their productivity. So this paper here, which is by Clive Belfield, it was released by Ready Nation, which is an organization that provides information like this to business community and business organizations about the relationship between business and early care and education. So as you can see from here, these are questions that relate to productivity and performance at work. And they ask parents that have children under the age of 3 if they've had any problems participating in work-related education or training, or been reprimanded by a supervisor due to a childcare problem. The researchers focus in on these responses to whether they had hours reduced, have they been let go or fired, and in order to start to look at what the economic implications might be for that family, for the businesses as well. Career pathways, as you can see here, 25% notice they reduced their regular work hours due to childcare problems, or they turned down a new job offer, or that they changed from full-time to part-time work or quit a job. So as you look at these results, I mean, looking at parents who are working or in the workforce, for those of you that have had young children, have been in with childcare, child rearing has challenges. Things do fall through the cracks. There are challenges there. But you can imagine that a system that is more reliable could potentially help support these parents that are having these difficulties. So businesses have been able to focus on some of these results and think about where they position themselves in terms of providing support with childcare. So based on these parent survey results, what the research paper does is look at the 11 million families that have young children and parents and consider where they are working, and then estimate what the losses are to parents due to lost earnings and extra costs of job searching, costs to businesses because of their lost revenue and extra costs to rehire, and then also reductions to taxpayers because there's lower income and tax and sales tax. So in response to this research and just to experience on the ground, business leaders have taken some steps, such as providing on-site childcare for larger companies that are able to do that. For those companies that have provided on-site childcare and have stuck with it over the years, they have claimed that while they subsidize that service, they do receive benefits in terms of reducing turnover. Companies also can provide employer-sponsored dependent care, which provides flexible spending accounts that allows employees to exclude taxation up to $5,000 that they would then spend on childcare. Businesses have also started to be creative, especially in rural areas where it's even more challenging to find childcare, to help to work with either family-based programs, family childcare programs, or centers to sponsor slots, specific spaces to guarantee that there would be space available for their parent employees to have access to childcare. And some just directly pay to help support their own parent employees with their childcare expenses. And finally, that they recognize that one of the challenges within the field of early care and education is that a lot of the business providers did not come out from business school. They came more from an education background to be able to support that sector with business training and mentoring so that the business side of childcare has stronger support. So that's what we see in some of the activities with business leaders here in Minnesota and other parts of the country. So now we're going to turn to the taxpayers and what Minnesota has done in terms of early care and investments within this state. So this is a chart here that shows different funding categories. And starting at the bottom is the Child Care Assistance Program. And what Child Care Assistance does is provides subsidies to low-income families to be able to use that subsidy at a licensed family child care program or a child care center. And the subsidy is, if you look at reimbursement rates, they tend to fall short of the true full cost of providing care. So for those who are in the field and are receiving those subsidies, they often fall short of what it costs to provide it. But businesses are looking at how to be able to use that subsidy as a source to help that continuity of service to parents that have them. So child care assistance is both federally and state funded, and you can see is a large share of the support in this sector. Then we come to Head Start, which includes early Head Start, and then to the school district funding. School districts could include support mostly for 4-year-olds, sometimes for 3. And then finally, early learning scholarships. And what early learning scholarships are is a mechanism to provide resources to low-income families so that they can access a variety of programs that are included in all the ones that I mentioned before. That is, they can use their scholarship to access a program that's provided by a school, public school, by Head Start, or a family child care or a child care center. The programs need to be in this state's quality rating system that is called Parent Aware. And Parent Aware is a way to provide a pathway towards improving quality for programs, and is also a way to give information to parents about the quality of programs. Provides 4 stars, so you can be from 1 star to 4 star, and be able to provide information to parents about what to look for in terms of quality, questions to ask providers about their services. And early learning scholarships are also able to be flexible in that they follow the family on where they choose to use that scholarship. So going back to the slide where I talked about importance of high return principles, if we look at this particular funding stream, it matches a lot of them. That is, they focus on engaging parents. Parents receive these scholarships. They can be empowered to use the scholarships at a program of their choice. They are flexible, and they are targeting children who are the most at risk. Right now it's for low-income 3- and 4-year-old children, and also high-risk children ages 0 to 2. And that they can be used at a variety of programs that meet this quality threshold that can prepare children for school. They have been in play in pilot form since 2008, and now there are $70 million that are available. However, we're not all of the way there, as you can imagine. The good news about the chart that you're seeing here is what? It's going up. A colleague of mine just looked at this chart earlier today, and he said, you know, sometimes I wish these charts would go back to 2000. Why did he say that? Well, you'd see that there's a big cut back in 2003 to put this increase in perspective. But gains are being made, primarily within the funding for school districts and through early learning scholarships. Early learning scholarships right now are capped at $7,500 per year per family that receives them. And what I've done in terms of a back-of-the-envelope calculation is to understand what if we provided a little more flexibility with that cap so that it could be higher, a family could pay more at a program of their choice. And what if we were to provide enough resources to fully fund 3s and 4s, which the state is doing better in terms of reaching 4-year-olds, need some more work to do there, but it's much further behind for 0 to 2. And the price tag is somewhere between $350 and $400 million. That is, you almost double that last bar to get there. But research would suggest with this targeted investment in the long run, we'd get a very high rate of return. So in your slides, there's plenty of follow-up reading to do here in terms of sources. And then just to summarize your takeaways, early years are a sensitive period for brain development. We can yield high rates of return if we invest early. Within the early care and education market, we want to think both about the impact on the children and on how this supports parents to enter the workforce. And finally, for public policy, really targeting resources to low to moderate income families so they can access a variety of programs. So as we mentioned, This is a conversation. So now we come to the conversation part of our time together. And we have some microphones because this is being live streamed. So for our viewing audience, we want to hear your question on the microphone. And we'll look forward to having some discussion.
Hello. I wrote down my question because I'm a public school teacher and this is the first week of school, so I'm barely coherent. So the needs of the child are not always aligned to the demands of his or her parent's employer. And you referenced extended day childcare totaling or exceeding 45 hours a week. That means that children and parents have less time to connect and less quality time, as the remaining hours are usually relegated to eating and sleeping. Furthermore, so many contact hours leads to teacher burnout. So children need to be with their families, and I think we'd see adverse effects if that diminished. Is anyone making this point?
I'm really glad you brought this up. It's there's many points in here. First of all, just from a workforce perspective, empathizing as a fellow teacher, recognizing that professionals in the early care and education have a tough job, and that is long hours. It is continuous work. Children are very engaged, and we want those professionals to be supported and to be well trained and to be able to have those really positive interactions with children, which we see in the research really helps with the child outcomes. So that's an important part to think about, in terms of how to support that sector, in terms of professionals, how to bring more resources into that sector, such as if we were to increase our public support through early learning scholarships, as an example, that would give more resources to programs, have higher value subsidies and scholarships. But to your point about the interesting point on research in terms of parent contact hours and what we've seen over time. And I'm going to reference a colleague of mine who's looked at this a little more closely. And that is, even though we have more working parents and more parents are in the workforce, is that we see that the amount of quality time that parents spend with their children has been increasing. So even though we see the tension, and these are the choices that families have to wrestle with. Do I have child in childcare, or do we have more contact hours together? But we do see that overall, some of this research about child development, brain development, is out there and is being potentially acted on in that way. The last point that I'll make about that is that when we see interventions that support low-income families, and when they're provided a high-quality experience for their child to attend. And here I'm referring to a program that provided care from ages 1 to 3, that helps support the parents in a few different ways. One, it helped them attain employment, but it also helped improve their parenting. And they see some better interactions between parents and those young children. And there we're seeing that there was actually a reduction in contact hours. So that's just to say is that there's nuance to be able to look at. It might be more what is the quality of that experience, whether it's at home or if it's in that center, than just only the amount of time.
If this information has been known for many years or maybe many decades, why doesn't the federal government come up with something where children start education before 5 years old and say that has to be done so that you get better educated people in the long run?
So, well, a few different responses there. Children don't vote, for one. So their interests have to be spoken for by others. But it does call the question. I think the research that you're hearing from tonight, a lot of this could have been a similar presentation 15 years ago. What is our half glass full, half-empty story here. Both at the federal level and at the state level, progress has been made in the past 15 years. We see gains at the state level in terms of what is being spent on young children. The federal government, even the federal government in the last couple of years has increased the amount of support for the childcare subsidy system, even a bit for Head Start. So there has been some progress, but by no means are we there yet. And other countries around the world have acted on this research. That is, there are a lot of choices that are available to young children, especially in European countries. And they look at being able to make sure that there is that continuum of support. And also, one of the topics we're not talking about is parental leave, but we see other choices that countries have made there. But we have this system that we're going to work with. And how do we start with an early care and education system that is largely a private market? This isn't government stepping in and providing. About 70% of the dollars in the childcare market is coming from parents. So it's parents paying for childcare. All of the subsidy and public support that I shared with you before is a relatively smaller percent. So being able to take the variety of choices and be able to infuse dollars into that system and keeping it a variety of choices, I think, is important. That's why this scholarship model is intriguing, because it essentially follows a higher education model. In higher education, we provide scholarships to lower-income families. There's a variety of choices out there of colleges that are public and colleges that are private, and society makes sure that children who graduate and can go to college can afford it. Just, at least some support is there. We could do more. We could probably do a little better there too. But to bring that same logic here to early care and education, largely a private market, but how can we make sure that we get some more buying power from families who need it the most?
Hi. When I have conversations about early childhood programs in the community, there are quite a number of those conversations that include wondering about how we define quality. Because there are a lot of families that define quality as culturally similar to their family, or linguistically similar to their family. And I'm just wondering if those kinds of considerations were included in any of these studies, or if we're thinking about that as another layer of quality.
Yeah, it's a great question. Gretchen, good to see you. The quality, last year we had a conference here in last October. It was to commemorate the 15 years that the Minneapolis Fed's been working on this issue. But we focused a session specifically on quality and how to articulate what we know about quality and how to advance quality. And the field's still working out some aspects of that. But what we do recognize, as I mentioned before, is that interaction between a teacher and a child and what happens there during that interaction, that responsiveness, is what helps support that early learning. And to be able to have teachers that have good coaching and support and background, to be able to have those enriching interactions is very important. Relationships are key to child development. The other piece is curriculum that helps to provide a strategy and some intentional strategy to move forward through the day and through the week and through the months within a program. And while there isn't an anointed curriculum, we do recognize that there are curriculum that have been identified as being able to walk through a program and to help support this quality interaction. So those are two parts that often get talked about. And it's more that the field is learning about. Of course, facilities are also coming to fore as an area to look at in terms of making sure that we have a facility that is sound and provides good space for young kids. But I think it's a nuance that it's hard to train parents to go out and look for the conversations that you're mentioning, and to be able to have parents be able to step in and find out, like, what are the interactions like? What is this curriculum following? How do I find out about how my child's development is moving forward? These are all areas that high quality programs are really lending themselves to do, whether they're smaller programs in homes or at centers. Parent Aware is this state's offering to be able to help put guidance and framework around what quality is. It's also a system that has been learning over time. Evaluations of Parent Aware have been able to go out and be able to look at what child outcomes are relative to the types of programs that they go to, and from that information come back and retool that system. So quality is still an important discussion that we're having. Yeah.
Hi, Rob. When we think of childcare, we often think of it as a service that helps other parents to go to work, but it really is more of a three-pronged stool sort of thing where in and of itself childcare is a business, and it's quite a large one in Minnesota. And then the other piece of that is that we are building brains, getting our next generation of workers started off in a nurturing, warm environment. And so can you talk to those two things a little bit?
The business and the future workforce.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as mentioned during the presentation part, is that the business side of childcare is important because the program can only be as successful as it is able to keep those doors open, operations moving. And as a sector, it's relatively large within our economy. If you add up all of the amount of receipts and the amount of employees that are working there, I mean, this is a sector that should be well established within chambers of commerce or on the table of business development programs to think about the size of the childcare sector. But they tend to be smaller businesses, and as I mentioned before, tend to be professionals who are coming more from an education standpoint as opposed to the business side. So being able to work with organizations that help to support that business side, that business training is important. First Children's Finance is a program here in this state that provides some of that service. Also in other parts, especially in rural areas, they have a rural project. Imagine the initiative foundations have been supporting the business side of childcare also throughout rural Minnesota. And this is where within a smaller community or even a larger community like this, if you can bring professionals from business to mentor some of the childcare providers, this can be a way to help support their business skills and be able to show, like, here's some strategies around marketing or pricing your program or how to work with budgeting and so on. The second part is that long-term perspective in terms of workforce, is that in the early part of the presentation, when we looked at aspects of the Preschool project or the Abecedarian early childhood project, these investments in young children can happen in a variety of settings. The quality, the interaction between the teacher and the child can happen in a small group setting, can happen in a center, can happen in a public school. It's just we want to be able to wrap those children around that support and education. So the childcare market to be really thought of as helping to produce our future workforce, the next generation of workers, is very important.
Hello. Do you have an opinion if a more universal basic income approach would have a similar outcome, like just giving parents money? Would that produce some of the same results as opposed to these kind of fine-grained scholarships?
So whether to just write a check and say, use this money. Yes, I haven't compared the results of, I haven't statistically, looking at research to match them together. What is the benefit of, let's say, an early learning scholarship is that you're able to target and to where those resources would be going to high quality early childhood development. So you're supporting a specific direction for those funds. With that said, research has been conducted to be able to show, and actually there's an important research project underway to look at the impact of just more income for families with young children. And evidence from a paper that's been out for a little bit by Greg Duncan is suggestive that children or families that have very young children that have more income support then have some health benefits for those children that linger on into adulthood that you don't see when families with older children get the same type of support. What currently underway, we have but out there, is a research project looking at the impact of actually providing some income support to low-income families up and above what they would typically get from our public support system, and to understand what would $3,000 more a year have on a family. And we'd be able to hopefully be able to get some information about the impact on kids.
So you talked a little bit about how a lot of the research that was done in here was in the context of a greater choice architecture in the U.S., to where we kind of pursue more of a variety of choices and giving parents that choice to have in the context of our childcare system. I was wondering if you could extrapolate a little bit on kind of a more choice-based approach versus, let's say, a Scandinavian model that you had mentioned that might be more state-centric. I wonder if you see these returns of 16 to 1, 18 to 1, why markets haven't internalized that, and why maybe a more state-centric approach might be appropriate. And if you could just talk a little bit on the difference of those two.
Yeah, the reason why those high rates of return that you saw early on have not been internalized, because you make a very good point. If you have an investment in a market that's showing 18%, it's not going to sit on the table very long. That is going to get eaten up. But the benefits, the return on investment that we're seeing is diffused. It's spilling over to all of society. And that's why we don't see that particular private sector coming in and like, okay, let's provide early childcare and try to see if we can get that 18%. It's because once we invest in a child with, let's say, an early learning scholarship, and the child attends a program and they're ready for school, they succeed in school, the benefits are hard to capture just from that child. We can't go back and say, hey, we gave you that great benefit. Can you fork over the money, the return to us? It's because it's not just embodied in the child. It comes from reductions in the cost to education. It comes from reductions in crime costs. It helps, we see higher earnings. We see even some other benefits to society if that child goes on and gets more education in terms of participating in society. So in economics, we call it a market failure. That is, that we have these benefits that spill over outside of the transaction between that education experience and that child. So the European model is they're bringing resources from a public perspective and recognizing that they can achieve this benefit from providing an array of services in terms of preschool and childcare and also parental leave. So they're making their choice of making that investment from funding from the state perspective and just having it available. And to put this into perspective, just a very interesting conversation that I had at a group of business people about this issue. We're talking about how can we as a community and what role can business play in helping to support the early care and education sector, and maybe we can get some community scholarships in here, or maybe we can find ways that business can help support supply. And there was a Norwegian business owner who said, wow, we don't have this discussion in Norway. And he asked a curious question. He says, well, isn't childcare required? When is childcare going to be required? And we'd say, no, we don't require childcare. That's a choice of the families. And his point was, no, in our country, actually, if a parent wants it, the government is required to provide the service. Okay, so that's looking over the Atlantic Ocean. It's a different system. They're making a lot of different choices. So to internalize that high rate of return, I think our strategy going forward is going to be different than Norway.
Hi. I have to say, overall, the economics of childcare just totally puzzles me. I mean, it seems like costs go up, providers continue to earn very low incomes. And then I also wonder a couple of things in regard to what you presented. If you are talking about a recommended increase in the total amount, I forget the dollar amount, the millions of dollars you mentioned, does that account for an increase to providers, or does that account for a status quo of continuing to pay providers 11, whatever it was an hour that you said is the current rate? And then finally, if we increase that through, say, scholarships, and the scholarships go to families, say, I don't know, under $30,000, does that then further increase the cost for the families making $37,000? So I'm just puzzled, and I ask you as the economist to help us sort that through.
Absolutely. Those are great questions. I'm going to start with the latter one first. Is we do want to avoid what's called the cliff effect. And right now in our systems, the child care subsidy system in Minnesota does offer a gradient. So that is, you can earn more income and still receive your subsidy. And it takes more income in order to actually lose that benefit. So it's important to build in these ways. So and ideally, with a scholarship system, just as we have in higher education, we'd have a gradation of benefit going out over time. That is, you'll have free up into a certain point of income, and then after that you are partially paying an increasing amount as income goes up. So that is a strategy that definitely want to build into our system. And for that raw number I gave you there, I did not build that part in, but we're looking at what that cost might be. And to your first point about quality, people are hard at work at this. In fact, we had a meeting today on how to be able to understand some pieces we could put into a model or to our thinking about increasing aspects of quality or what a pay for a teacher might be in order to assess what that dollar total would look like. And I think the puzzle that you bring about the early care and education market is the puzzle we are struggling with, is that yes, we get high value from this. Prices are really high. It's a challenge for families to afford it. And yet we need to increase quality, which make the prices go higher. So there is some role in order to capture that public benefit for the government to be able to step in and help to support it more. Then we'll be accruing that benefit. And that we will be getting that highest benefit when we are reaching the lower and then into moderate income families. That's why, especially in this state, a universal approach where you subsidize everyone, going back to the chart that I showed, the good news is that our top 25% of families earn more than $115,000. Not to say that life is always easy for all families that make that much money, but if we went universal, we'd end up subsidizing that quadrant, whereas we could spend twice as much money on families that make $35,000 or less, the bottom quartile.
Rob, we have one more question over here. That's our last question for the evening.
Rob, your chart on Minnesota's investment in early childhood education shows relatively strong growth in investments from 2013 through about 2017, and then a flattening of that investment that you see for 18, 19, your projection for 20 and 21. In the last legislative session, the Child Care Assistance Program was threatened with extinction by one party in the legislature. Early learning scholarships were flat in the last session. Where do you see the state's interest in growing its investment in early childhood, given what's happened in the last couple of years?
Well, I think anytime after a legislative session, that is the time to bring up as we look to 2021. So I think that being able to bring forward information about, how this investment would be made now is the time to start having those discussions and to doing some of the fact finding. What would it look like if we were to increase resources, let's say in early learning scholarships? What if we provided a gradient of those scholarships going forward so we can make those choices? And any questions about the political outcome in that landscape is completely out of my wheelhouse. So I'm going to fully punt that down the field there. So with that, I just want to close by thanking you all for coming. I want to point out that on our webpage, we have an early childhood development page which you can go to and read a lot more, not just about early care and education, but some of the other topics that we cover within early childhood development. And also, I did see a few more hands up, so just know I'll be around for a bit. We can keep the conversation going. So thank you very much.
We would appreciate you filling out the evaluation form at your place setting and letting us know what other topics you'd like to hear about in the future. Thanks for coming.